Mid-19th century, Tuscaloosa County, Alabama, where the Black Warrior River cut through fertile Black Belt land and cotton made people rich through forced labor. There were many terrible things that happened during that time, but one story was passed down through the generations in slave quarters. It wasn't about mean masters or overseers who didn't care. It was about something much worse. It was about a man who had been a slave and knew how painful it was, and who decided to turn that pain into money. This is the story of George Crow, a free black man who was more feared than any white slave owner in the area. It is a story about betrayal, greed, and how the system corrupted even those who should have fought against it. I'd like to know where you're watching from before we go on. And if this is your first time watching, you might want to subscribe. We should remember stories like this that are hard to hear. Let's go into the dark parts of Tuscaloosa now. The small piece of land was about 8 miles north of Tuscaloosa, hidden among cypress and oak trees that lined the Black Warrior River. 15 acres of land that looked like a small cotton farm at first glance. No one paid attention to the cypress wood house with a narrow porch that faced the river. That choice was on purpose. In December 1842, George Crow bought that land. He officially grew cotton on a small scale. Records from the county show that he was just another free black man trying to make ends meet. His white neighbors watched him with a wary eye. His name meant something very different in the slave quarters, though. People said different things about him, calling him a savior or a traitor. That lack of clarity was his best weapon. George was 35 years old and had broad shoulders from working hard. He also had a surprisingly soft voice. His polished speech surprised those who thought he would speak like a typical slave. He could read and write, which was a rare and dangerous skill for someone who was born into slavery. His looks gave him exactly what he needed: trust. He kept a low profile for the first few months after buying the property. He grew enough cotton to make owning land worthwhile, but people who paid attention would see that farming wasn't his main source of income. He went on trips a lot, riding to faraway plantations and disappearing for days. When asked about business, he gave vague answers. In May 1843, the first public proof of what he was really doing came to light. Thomas, a slave from Riverside Plantation, had run away. He was thought to be smart and well-informed about the area, so his chances of getting to free land seemed good. Charles Brennan offered a $300 reward, which drew in a lot of hunters. 3 days later, George brought Thomas straight to Brennan. He was tied up, tired, and completely defeated. Landowners in the area paid attention. A free black man who could find fugitives was a useful person to have around. Brennan paid right away, and other masters started looking for George when they had the same problems. But for slaves, that capture had a dark meaning. People last saw Thomas near George's property. People said that he had asked for help, trusted the free black man, thought he was safe, and then had been taken back into captivity. People are guessing, but there is no proof, and no witnesses who can speak freely. George kept climbing, taking on contracts that paid more and more. He never used violence that wasn't needed. His real weapons were words, patience, and a deep understanding of how desperate people think. He made 18 documented captures between 1843 and 1845. Each one added to his growing wealth and helped his reputation spread even more. Landowners started calling on him for more than just simple escapes, for rebellious slaves, people who asked questions, and natural leaders who inspired others. George would show up and talk to people in the slave quarters for days at a time, always in a casual way. After that, for some reason, those bad things would be sold or punished. George got paid separately for each intervention, usually between $50 and $200. No official records, just cash on hand. His wealth grew quickly, but money wasn't his only goal. George built a network of friends, a good name, and power that went beyond being a free black man. White masters asked him for advice, trusted his judgment, and did what he said. That special place would let him get something much more valuable. August 1845 was a very important time. After the previous owners went bankrupt, Holly Ridge, A 50-acre farm 18 miles north of Tuscaloosa was for sale for a low price. The property was alone near the Sipsey River and could only be reached by trails through thick woods. Garrett Lynch, a gambler with a history of violence and a lot of debt, became the official buyer in the records. George actually paid for everything, but he stayed in the background. A white overseer running a farm far away would not raise any eyebrows. Having two properties as a free black man would make people suspicious. There would be no record of Holly Ridge's operation in any document. Over the next few months, George started sending slaves there. Not the valuable runaways, who he sent back to their masters, but the others, the ones who weren't worth much, the many rebels that no one wanted to buy back. These just vanished. Not the fear of the whip or the cruel master, but something worse. The fear that even the oppressed were not really united, that the free black man by the Black Warrior River was the most dangerous predator of all. His business grew in a planned way. George didn't just catch people who were on the run. He bought them, broke them, and then sold them again for a lot of money. He built a silent empire that most people couldn't see, but it was very real for the people who fell into his hands. The monster was fully grown, and he would do anything to make money. The market price for Moses was $1,200. He was a skilled blacksmith from Riverside Plantation. His hands were rough and scarred from old burns, but he shaped iron with great accuracy. James Whitfield, who got the plantation from Charles Brennan, thought it was a good investment. Moses, on the other hand, didn't want to be treated like cattle. The law allowed slaves to buy their own freedom, but only very rarely. Whitfield had once said in passing that he would think about selling Moses's freedom for $400, which is a huge amount of money, but not impossible. Moses worked for other people on Sundays, doing small repairs, making custom tools, and making horseshoes. Whitfield got the money, but he sometimes let Moses keep small amounts, like pennies that slowly added up. After 6 years of hard work, they found $340 in a can buried under the forge floor. 16, sometimes 18 hours daily, bleeding hands, backs in constant agony. But each coin brought freedom closer. April 1849 should have been a month of victory. Only $60 remained. James Whitfield discovered the money during a routine inspection. When he opened the can, he found an unexpected treasure. The law was clear. Slaves could not own property. The master technically owned those $340. Whitfield took everything. Moses begged and said he was saving up to buy his promised freedom. Whitfield said he hadn't made that promise, accused Moses of stealing, and gave him 20 lashes as punishment. The master put the $340 in his pockets. A lot of people would have given up. This time, Moses started over, being extra careful. Whitfield would never go to the slave cemetery near his mother's grave, where the money was buried. 2 years of even harder work than normal slavery destroyed his body faster than decades of normal slavery. In June 1851, the total went up to $320. Not the whole $400, but close enough to try. But this time, Moses didn't trust Whitfield. A house slave brought rumors about George Crow to Sunday market. He was a free black man who helped the oppressed, had connections, knew the law, and made deals with white masters. Some people said he helped people buy their freedom. On June 12, Moses rode 22 miles to George's property. He had everything he owned with him, $320 and 8 years of hope in the form of worn coins. George welcomed him with unsettling kindness, water, simple food, and a place to sleep. He listened to Moses' story with a face that looked like he really cared, nodded at the right times, and asked questions that showed he was really interested. He said he would help, and that he knew Whitfield. He said he would negotiate Moses' freedom, and that with $320 and his own influence, he could get Whitfield to agree to an agreement. He wanted 2 days. Moses should stay out of sight while George makes the last-minute plans. Moses gave the money to someone else to keep safe. George put it in a safe box. Moses rested for the first time in years for 48 hours, ate slowly, and thought about what it would be like to be free. George came by to talk every now and then, always being positive about how the negotiations were going. George rode to Riverside on the morning of the third day, but not to talk about freedom. He told Whitfield that his slave, Moses, had run away and was hiding on the property of a free black man. He also said that Moses had $320, which was probably stolen, and that he could deliver him quietly so there wouldn't be an embarrassing public search. How much for the information and the capture? $150. Whitfield said yes right away. $150 was a good deal compared to what Moses was worth. In addition, he would get back the $320, which was a sure profit in every way. George came back that afternoon and said the negotiation was going well, but Whitfield wanted to meet in person to sign the deal. Moses should get some sleep before the big meeting the next day. He slept with hope, feeling sure. George tied his hands and feet with strong ropes at night. Moses woke up at dawn, unable to move. When he saw James Whitfield come in with 2 armed guards, his confusion turned to horror. There was no need for words. They brought Moses back to Riverside. Whitfield got the $320, which was the promised amount, along with the $150. George got $470, which is more than Moses could have saved in 10 years. The punishment was very harsh, 100 lashes in the center of Tuscaloosa on the 17th of June, 1851. Not at Riverside, where only slaves would see it, but in public. Whitfield made it clear. Stealing to get away caused unimaginable pain. Moses lived through the beating. But that day, something important in him died. 2 weeks later, on July 1st, early in the morning, he was found hanging in his own forge. The chain he had made years ago held up his body, along with tools that had been part of his dreams. The hands that shaped hot metal tied the last knot. There was no inquiry. Slaves couldn't write down their sadness. Whitfield lost $1,200 worth of property, but he kept the $320 that Moses had saved. George lost less, and it was just another successful deal. For slaves in the area, it was a terrifying lesson that spread like wildfire through dry cotton. 8 years of hard work, 2 thefts of money, betrayal by a free black man, public whipping, and hanging in the forge. Most importantly, the name George Crow. A name that should have stood for hope, possibility, and unity, now meant the opposite. George turned hope into money, sold dreams back to nightmares, and knew the language of freedom only to use it as a trap. Moses wasn't the first, and he won't be the last. The blacksmith who dreamed of freedom became a warning that slaves whispered to each other, and George kept doing what he was doing, not caring about the damage he was causing. He saw each victim as just a number in his growing accounts. Cruelty had a face, and that face made even the most careful people trusted enough to kill. Holly Ridge was only 18 miles north of Tuscaloosa, near the Sipsey River, but it felt like it was in a different world. A narrow path, covered in thick plants, kept it hidden from people who weren't looking for it. The centuries-old oaks made a roof that kept the sun out, even at noon. The thick air, which smelled like swamp and decay, kept unwanted visitors away. The best place to hide things that shouldn't be happening. Garrett Lynch, the official owner, was a 2-year-old white man known for being violent. He had run away from central Alabama with gambling debts and accusations of assault. George picked him for that reason. Lynch owed $400 and didn't care where his money came from. He was the registered owner of Holly Ridge, so he got a monthly salary and did what he was told without asking questions. The farm became a place where people could break things. George sent slaves who couldn't just be sent back, runaways with little reward, stubborn rebels, and slaves whose masters would rather sell them for less. He bought them for very little money and then put them through a brutal process of change. Lynch ran things with sadistic creativity. The sweatbox was about 3 feet long, wide, and tall, which was big enough for a person to crouch in, but not big enough for them to move around. In the summer, when temperatures went over 90 degrees, it turned into an oven when it was put in direct sunlight in Alabama. People who were slaves were kept inside for 8 12, or even 18 hours at a time without water or enough air. Some people passed out, and others threw up until there was nothing left. A quick way to get rid of resistance without hurting the body permanently, which would lower the value of the sale. The iron gag held the tongue in place with tiny spikes for days, sometimes even a week. It made it hard to eat enough and caused mouth infections that caused constant pain but left no visible marks on the backs or arms that buyers looked at. Partial burial put slaves up to their necks in wet soil near the Sipsey swamp. Insects crawled all over people's faces. The sun burned without mercy. Not being able to move made the cramps worse. Some stayed like this for almost a whole day. Chains weighing 40 pounds were tied to people's ankles while they worked in the field, which caused deep wounds that often got infected. Every move was planned to be painful. The goal was never to get things done, but to completely break any remaining spirit. Holly Ridge saw 34 slaves come and go between 1,847 and 1,852. After the process, 27 were sold to people in the Deep South. After the breaking, George usually bought things for $50 to $200 and sold them for $400 to $800. 7 were never sold. They just vanished without a trace, leaving no records, graves, or explanations. When asked, George said that people escaped during transport or died from disease. No one looked into it very deeply. Slaves kept going missing, but there were rumors. George threw away some of them because they were too damaged to sell. The Black Warrior River was very deep. The Sipsey Swamp is huge. It would be easy for bodies to go missing. 2 miles below Holly Ridge, a fisherman found chains with dark stains on the riverbank. Sarah, who was 32 years old, and her 3 daughters were the most affected by the operation. When Philip Payne casually said he was going to sell his 2 older daughters to a plantation in Mississippi, Sarah made a desperate choice. In March 1850, she ran away with the 3 kids. A poorly planned attempt, especially with kids who are 9, 7, and 4 years old, caught in less than 3 days. George found them in an old barn that was 15 miles from Payne's land. The girls were scared and hungry. Sarah was tired, but still fighting. He came up to them alone, with no weapons, food, or water. He said he understood and that he would have done anything for family. He also said that there was a better way to solve the problem than running away. Sarah wanted to believe, even though she had no other choice. George persuaded her to come back on her own, promising to talk to Payne about keeping the family together. He said that landowners were more lenient with slaves who came back on their own and that his influence would make a difference. Sarah made the worst choice of her life. George talked about it, but not on the terms he had promised. Payne only offered $200 for the return, which was a low amount because Sarah was a problem. George saw a different chance. He paid $150 for Sarah and the 3 girls. Payne quickly agreed, happy to be rid of a slave who was acting up. George sold each girl on her own. The 9-year-old went to Alabama for $350. The 7-year-old went to Mississippi for $300. The youngest, who was only 4 years old, went to New Orleans for $400 to be a future house slave. Sarah had to watch as each one was taken. At that moment, George didn't lie. He wanted her to fully understand how powerless she was, so that despair would break her in a way that no physical method could. 6 weeks at Holly Ridge helped Sarah lose 35 pounds, going from 140 to 105. The sweatbox, working in chains, and not being able to eat. The chains left marks on her ankles that would not go away. Her hair started to come out in big chunks. Sarah no longer looked like the woman who had tried to save her daughters when she was finally sold to a buyer in Mississippi for $800. George made a total of $1,700. A smart act of cruelty turned a $150 investment into a fortune. Jason was 28 years old and worked on Richard Morrison's Oakwood plantation, which was about 12 miles from Tuscaloosa. He was a regular slave with no special skills that made him worth more on the market. Every day was the same for him: hard work, little food, and no hope. Everything changed in September 1851. Jason heard a conversation he shouldn't have heard at night. 6 slaves from Oakwood were going to run away together. The date was the new moon in October, when it would be easier to cross the first time. The way to go is to follow the Black Warrior north until you reach free states. They had basic maps, hidden supplies, and even people they thought would help them. Jason wasn't asked to join in. The people who were planning the crime thought he was too scared. George Crow came to Oakwood 2 days later. Morrison had called him to look at a slave who was giving him a lot of trouble. While he was there, George talked casually with a few slaves, including Jason. George and Jason were talking about work, the weather, and the harvests. But George could tell that Jason was nervous, was looking around a lot, and had something on his mind that he didn't want to talk about. After finishing his official work, George looked for Jason on his own. He said he could tell when someone was carrying a heavy secret and offered to listen and understand because he had once been a slave. Jason, who was alone and scared of what would happen if the escape was found out, started to talk. He told everything about the plot, the 6 names, the date, the route, and so on. George paid close attention and then made Jason an offer he never thought he would get. George would personally negotiate the purchase of Jason's freedom $500 as a bonus if Jason formally testified about the conspiracy, and George was able to alert Morrison and stop the escape. Jason would have enough money to start over and live far away from Alabama as a free man. Jason was in pain for a whole day. The 6 people who were in on the plot were his friends, but George's offer was everything Jason had ever wanted: freedom, money, and a future. He said yes. That night, George took Jason to Morrison. Jason told everyone he knew about the conspiracy again. Morrison was so angry at the thought of losing 6 valuable slaves at once that he acted right away. Before they even tried to run away, the 6 were caught. The punishment was harsh. Each person got 50 lashes in public. Within days, 3 of them were sold to buyers in Mississippi. The other 3 stayed at Oakwood, but they were kept in worse conditions on purpose as a permanent example. Morrison gave George $300 for bringing him the information that saved him $6,000 in property. As promised, George gave Jason $500. Jason couldn't believe it when he held the money in his shaking hands. $800. More money than he had ever seen. George told Jason that he would come back in a week to finish making plans for Morrison's freedom. Jason spent that week in a state of torturous waiting. Some slaves looked at him with silent hatred because they knew he had been the snitch. Some people didn't even talk to him. Jason was alone, but it didn't matter because he would be free in a few days. George came back as promised, but he didn't come back to talk about Jason's freedom. He went to see Morrison alone and made a different offer. Jason had become a problem because all the other Oakwood slaves hated him. His presence made things tense, angry, and dangerous. Also, Jason had shown that he was willing to betray his friends, which meant he could eventually become a problem for Morrison himself. George said he had a Texas buyer who wanted a slave without any local ties, so he offered to buy Jason for $600. Morrison agreed. It was a fair price to pay to fix a problem that was getting worse. People signed the papers. Jason was officially George's. When George told Jason, he went from being confused to panicking. George calmly told Jason that things had changed and that he would be sold to Texas instead of being set free. He also said that the $500 Jason had with him obviously belonged to George because slaves couldn't own property. Jason begged, promised anything, and reminded George of his promise to set him free. George just took back the $500 and got Jason ready to be taken away. A trader bought Jason 3 days later for $700 and promised to take him to Texas. The buyer liked that Jason didn't have any family or community ties, which made it less likely that he would run away. George made a total of $1,600. $300 from Morrison for the information, $600 from the difference between buying and selling, Jason, $500 back, and $100 Morrison paid extra for the convenience. Jason went missing in the Texas plantations. They said he never talked, worked like a robot, and had no hope in his eyes. He had betrayed 6 friends for a promise of freedom, but instead of getting freedom, he got slavery that was even harder to escape from. George had turned the informant into a victim, making money twice, by stopping Morrison from losing, and by selling the very thing that stopped him. Hannah was not a typical fugitive. She ran away from Riverside Plantation in April 1852 when she was 8 months pregnant. James Whitfield, her master, had said he would sell the baby as soon as it was born. Hannah had heard enough stories to know this wasn't just a threat. She ran away alone, pregnant, and in need. She didn't go very far. George found her 3 days later in an old barn that was only 10 miles from Riverside. Hannah was very tired, and her first contractions had already started. George came up to her with a kindness that she really wanted to believe was real. But George didn't bring her back to Whitfield. The reward was only $120, which isn't much. This is because Hannah had tried to escape before and was now pregnant, which made it harder for her to work for a while. George quickly did the math and saw a better chance. He told Whitfield that he could buy Hannah for $80 because he knew someone who needed a slave for light housework and didn't mind the pregnancy. Whitfield quickly agreed, glad to get rid of a problem. George brought Hannah to Holly Ridge and told her she could stay there until the baby was born. After that, he would work out a better deal for both of them. Hannah believed because she had to, even though she didn't have any other options. Hannah had a girl 12 days later. The delivery was hard because there wasn't enough medical help. Only another Holly Ridge slave was there to help, but Hannah and the baby both lived. George waited just 6 days, which was long enough for Hannah to get some strength back and for the baby to be sure it would live without constant nursing. He sold Hannah to a buyer in Mississippi for $600. She was a young woman who was strong even after what had just happened to her. She had years of work ahead of her. The buyer didn't care about escape history. He ran a plantation that was so isolated and brutal that escapes were almost impossible. Someone else bought the baby. A rich family in Montgomery, Alabama, wanted to train a house slave from birth. They would pay $350 for a baby that was healthy. Hannah's daughter was born when she was only 18 days old. Hannah begged, screamed, and tried to hold the baby when they came for her. Lynch had to use violence to break them up. Hannah's screams could be heard all over Holly Ridge for hours after the wagon with her daughter disappeared down the trail. Hannah was sent to Mississippi 2 days later. She was catatonic, didn't fight back, didn't talk, and was empty of everything but pain. George made a total of $870. An $80 investment turned into a fortune because they were patient and waited for a baby to be born. 1 capture, 2 sales, and the most efficient way to do business. Hannah's case became a very bitter rumor among pregnant slaves in the area. The warning was clear. George Crow's greed could reach even the most sacred bond, that of a mother. Some white landowners began to wonder, not out of compassion but out of professional curiosity, how Lynch was able to break slaves so completely in such a short amount of time. Visitors who came by from time to time said Lynch was uncomfortable because he said his methods were trade secrets. George never went to Holly Ridge when there were people from the outside world. Only a few people knew how he was connected to the farm. Lynch was the face of the company. George stayed in the background, making money and planning his next purchases. A great deal that let George keep his reputation clean while running one of the area's most brutal places. A slave named Benjamin started looking into the disappearance of his brother Lawrence in October 1852. Lawrence had run away 6 months earlier. There were rumors that Lawrence had looked for George. Benjamin quietly talked to other slaves, putting together pieces of disturbing information. He found Holly Ridge, where people had gone missing. Benjamin started to think that Lawrence was one of the 7 people who went missing without a trace. Anger grew until it was impossible to control. He would start to plan revenge, not escape, the only kind of justice that someone in his situation could get. Even white landowners, men who had no problem with slavery, said that Holly Ridge's methods were too harsh, not because they were inhumane, but because slaves who were too badly hurt lost value. None of them knew that Lynch was just a tool, and that the real mind behind Holly Ridge was the free black man they asked for help with problems. George had built an empire of cruelty that worked like a well-oiled machine, and profits kept rising as hundreds of people suffered on a regular basis. In July 1853, there was the first real attempt to kill George Crow. Two slaves from Oakwood Plantation, both in their 22nd, had lost a close friend to George during capture. George had broken the fugitive's arm on purpose, saying he needed to control him. The arm never healed right, so the slave was sold for less money to work in the Deep South. The two friends planned their revenge for weeks. Water hemlock root is a poisonous plant that grows in swamps. When prepared correctly, it can cause paralysis of the respiratory system and death within hours. The plan was simple. Put the poison in the whiskey that George drank a lot. One of the slaves worked as a delivery person and got into the property by pretending to be bringing supplies. He poured hemlock preparation into George's bottle while he wasn't paying attention. The amount was thought to be deadly, but it didn't taste like it. That night, George drank from that bottle. He felt very sick, threw up violently for hours, and had tremors and cold sweats, but the dose wasn't strong enough. The next morning, he was still alive, but very weak, and thought he had been poisoned. He didn't go to the police because that would have brought up questions that were hard to answer. He did his own investigation, putting pressure on the right people until he found out who was to blame. He went to see Richard Morrison, the master of Oakwood, and told him that two slaves had planned to poison a free black man. Morrison was so angry that he sold both of them to a traitor who would take them to Texas in a few days. No trial, no public whipping, no execution, just a quiet removal that solved the problem without causing any trouble. It was clear that it wouldn't be easy to kill George Crow. Benjamin, the slave who had lost his brother Lawrence, came in April of 1855. After months of looking into it, Benjamin was sure that George was to blame for the disappearance. Anger turned into cold determination. Benjamin, a skilled carpenter with tools, chose a more direct way, an axe ambush. He watched George's daily activities for weeks and found a weak spot on the trail that connected his property to the main road to Tuscaloosa. The thick plants made for great cover. Benjamin stood at the chosen spot on April 23rd, his heart racing with the thought of revenge. He heard hooves coming and got ready to jump. But George heard something, maybe a branch breaking, and he instinctively pulled the reins to stop. Benjamin jumped up with an axe in his hand. George was already moving, rolling off the saddle to the other side. The axe cut through the air where his head had been. Benjamin tried to attack again, but George pulled out the gun he had been carrying since the poisoning. He aimed at Benjamin and yelled for him to drop the axe. Benjamin was unsure. He could have gone on, probably dying, but maybe taking George with him. He couldn't move when he saw the weapon. Two warning shots brought farmers from a nearby field. They saw George with an axe pointing a gun at a slave. Benjamin was caught, tied up, and brought back to his master. For a slave, trying to kill a free man, even a black one, was a very serious crime. 5 days later, in Tuscaloosa's square, a public hanging. Hundreds of people saw it, including slaves who had to watch as a warning. George was there, watching with a blank look on his face. Benjamin was allowed to say his last words before the rope was put up. He looked right at George and said something that witnesses would remember in different ways. Different versions said that Benjamin used his last words to accuse George, but white authorities said it was just delirium. In November 1856, there was arson. Someone put dry hay against the outside wall of George's house and set it on fire at night. The fire spread quickly through the wooden building. George woke up to the smell of smoke and had to make a choice right away. The front door was blocked by flames. He ran to the back room, broke the window with a chair, and jumped as the roof fell in. He had burns on his hands and cuts from broken glass, but he lived. The house was almost completely destroyed, but George had a lot of money hidden away in a different place. Later, the investigation found that it was an accident, possibly caused by an ember from the fireplace. George knew what was going on. The third attempt to kill someone. 3 slaves from different farms were suspected but never found guilty. They were all whipped as a precaution. George rebuilt with changes: 2 emergency exits, windows that made it easy to get out, different rooms every night, no set pattern, and 3 guard dogs that were free to roam at night. Paranoia that made sense. The man who had built an empire on fear now lived in fear all the time. Every shadow was a danger, and every sound at night could mean an attack. He didn't go out much, and when he did, he always checked around. He paradoxically went to Holly Ridge more often, because he felt safer with Lynch and the overseers there to protect him. It was a cruel twist of fate that the place where he had suffered the most had become his safe haven. George lived through 3 documented attempts on his life, between 1853 and 1857, and there were probably other plots that never got to the point of execution. Every time he survived, his reputation as an indestructible person grew. Some slaves talked quietly about how they were protected by the supernatural. The truth was easier. Be very careful, be paranoid, and pay attention all the time. Not magic, just a constant state of alertness. But there are limits to caution. Someone would eventually be smart, patient, and desperate enough to get past all of George's defenses. That person was at Holly Ridge, working in chains, watching, learning, and making plans. Something that would require a final sacrifice, not just from George, but also from the executor. He would learn that true revenge doesn't leave anyone alive, only justice, even if it's only for a short time. In March of 1856, Nathan got to Holly Ridge, 24 years old, body marked by whipping scars, reputation as an incorrigible fugitive. 3rd escape attempt in 2 years. His master was sick of dealing with him and sold Nathan to George for just $100, which was a risky investment. Rumors about Holly Ridge spread among slaves in the area. It was a place where spirits were broken and rebels became obedient shadows. Nathan came expecting the worst. Lynch received him with a smile that promised suffering. First days brought standard treatment. Sweatbox under scorching sun, work in 40-pound chains that tore ankles, food deprivation. Nathan screamed, cried, begged, like everyone did. Something in him, however, remained intact. Nathan didn't plan to escape when he was locked in the shed that served as slave quarters at night. He had tried 3 times and failed each time. Escape was no longer viable, but revenge still was. Careful watching began. Lynch wasn't really the owner, just the overseer. A free black man came by once a month to ride, check on the slaves, talk about values, and look over the operations. Nathan found out that George Crow was a man. The truth came out. Lynch was a puppet, and George was the real demon. Nathan lived in Holly Ridge for more than 2 years, going through planned torture, hard work, and nights when he wished he were dead, but he never let them completely break his spirit. He pretended to be obedient when he needed to, did what he was told to do, stayed out of trouble, and always watched. He learned the routine very well. After drinking, Lynch slept soundly. George always came to visit in the first week of the month and stayed for one night. The chains used padlocks that were all the same. Nathan saw the keys while working at the forge where tools were fixed. He memorized their shapes and worked quietly, making a rough copy with a hidden piece of iron. 3 months of slow work that he only did when he was sure no one was watching. He tried it once, and the key worked. He could get out whenever he wanted. But why? If you escaped, you would be caught again and punished harshly. Nathan wanted something that would last. Morgan, a 40-year-old man who had lost his wife to George's hands, sold separately after capture. He was another slave who hated George. Morgan didn't say much, but when Nathan quietly told him about his plan, Morgan's eyes showed that he understood. The month of August, in 1858, Nathan finished getting ready. A simple plan, clear, and with no way out for him. He had come to terms with the fact that he would die. The question was making George go with him. George came for the monthly inspection on August 3rd with papers about future sales. He spent the day looking at buildings and talking to Lynch. Nathan worked in the fields while watching from a distance. George ate dinner with Lynch at the farm office at night. Lynch finally made it to his room, drunk as usual. The property fell silent. Nathan freed himself around midnight with his copied key. He moved through the dark like a ghost, freeing Morgan as well. They looked at each other in a way that didn't need words. First stop, The storage shed, where the kerosene was kept. Holly Ridge had a lot of stock. Nathan and Morgan each carried big jugs that held about 2 gallons. Morgan went to the shed where George slept. It was a small wooden building next to the main office. Nathan had told them about the plan days before. Morgan pretended to be very sick and moaned loudly enough to wake George, but not Lynch, who was drunk. George woke up angry. He went outside to see where the moans were coming from and found Morgan lying on the ground near the shed, apparently having a seizure. George's greed was stronger than his caution. Morgan had whispered about secret money between moans. Nathan came out of the dark when George bent down to hear better. A heavy piece of wood hit George's neck. It wasn't hard enough to kill him, but it was enough to knock him out. Morgan helped pull the body that was unconscious into the shed. They did their work quickly. They used ropes that had already been made to tie George up. They also locked the door from the outside with a simple latch that was made stronger with wood. The building wasn't as complicated as the main office. It was a simple slave quarters, with only 1 door and 2 small windows. Nathan poured kerosene around the bottom of the shed, soaking the dry wood. He made a path from the second jug to other buildings in Holly Ridge. Morgan stacked hay against the door. George started to wake up. At first, he was confused, but then he panicked when he realized he was tied up. He started yelling, asking for answers, and offering money. Nathan lit a match that he had stolen a few weeks before. He looked at the small flame for a moment, knowing he couldn't go back. Everything would be decided as soon as he lit the fire. Capture, torture, and a public execution. He started the fire. Flames spread very quickly, and in a scary way. Kerosene turned a small fire into a huge one. The dry wood caught fire, as if it were waiting for that moment. The shed was on fire in less than 5 minutes. George yelled for Lynch and anyone else who could help him get free from the ropes. He even offered money to anyone who could help him. Nathan and Morgan stayed outside to watch. Other slaves woke up to the fire and got out of their cells. Some people ran. Some people stayed, unable to move. Nathan yelled so everyone would know who was on fire. George Crow, the traitor who had sold hundreds of people back to suffering. Holly Ridge was paying for what it had done wrong. Eventually, Lynch woke up, staggered, saw the shed on fire, yelled for water, and tried to get people to help. It was too late. The flames had spread. The whole of Holly Ridge was starting to catch fire. There was complete chaos. George's last minutes were a living hell for so many people, but not because of physical fire. Instead, they were caused by broken hope, families being torn apart, and dreams turning into nightmares. Fire was just another way to do it. The end result was the same: total pain. George Crow died while screaming. When the fire was put out at dawn, all that was left of the shed were ashes and burned wood. The body was found close to the door, and the hands were burned to the bone. The ring he wore was the only way to tell who he was. Nathan and Morgan didn't try to get away. They stayed there and waited to be caught. There was no need to run away. They had finished what they set out to do. George was gone. Holly Ridge was ruined. They accepted what was going to happen with an unsettling calm, returned to Tuscaloosa in chains. The trial didn't take long. Witnesses said that someone set fire to something on purpose and killed a free man. The sentence was clear: death by hanging in public. On the 27th of August, 1858, Nathan and Morgan were hanged. Hundreds of people came, including slaves who had to watch. Authorities wanted to send a message about what happened to slaves who killed free men. Before the ropes were put on, both were given a chance to say goodbye. Nathan stared at the group of slaves. His voice was calm, almost peaceful. He didn't say he was innocent or beg for mercy. He only said that knowing that those who came after him wouldn't have to deal with problems at Holly Ridge would help him sleep better. Morgan just nodded once, his eyes on the horizon. People were put to death. Hanging bodies as a warning for hours. But in slave quarters, the story was told in a different way. Nathan and Morgan were not criminals. They were heroes, men who brought justice, even if only for a short time, to a world that didn't offer justice for people like them. Weeks later, George's property was sold at auction. They found about $4,300 in cash buried. The state got the money because there were no known heirs. A fortune made from betrayal and pain was spread among bureaucrats who never knew the names of the people who died to make it. People left Holly Ridge. People didn't want to build anything on the site again. Lynch went missing not long after the fire, likely to avoid being questioned. Some people said he moved west, while others said he changed his name. The final outcome was still unknown. The slaves who survived from Holly Ridge were sold to different owners and moved around. Sarah, who lost 3 daughters, lived until at least 1862, when she was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. Records don't say if she ever found her daughters again. Moses died before George Crow did, but slaves remembered his story. People spoke about Moses with respect. He was a man who tried to do the impossible and paid the ultimate price. 3 years before Benjamin got his revenge on George, he was put to death for trying to kill him with an axe. George's sense of invincibility was diminished with each attempt, even the ones that failed. George Crow's story became famous in slave communities, but not as a success. Instead, it was a warning about how the system corrupted even those who should have been united, about how freedom without humanity was just another form of prison, and about how betrayal was a crueler tool than any whip. But it was also a story about standing up to oppression, and how there were people who were willing to give up everything to make sure that cruelty didn't go unpunished. Nathan and Morgan were aware that they would die. They planned revenge even though they knew they wouldn't live. They went ahead because some things are more important than staying alive. There are some wrongs that need to be righted, no matter what it costs you. George built an empire on betrayal, starting with the 8 slaves who tried to run away in 1835 and were caught by him. He turned trust into a weapon, solidarity into a trap, and hope into something that could be bought and sold to the highest bidder. In the end, he died like so many other victims, in prison, with no way to get out, and suffering while seconds felt like hours. When it came, justice was cruel in a poetic way. For years, Holly Ridge's ashes could still be seen. Travelers saw burned-out buildings that were a quiet reminder of what had happened there. In the end, the forest took back the space. Trees grew in places where foundations had been destroyed. Nature hid the scars on the body. The scars of memory were still deeper. The legacy of ashes comes to an end. The system that let George Crow live didn't change when he died. Slavery went on for many years until it was finally ended. Holly Ridge was just one of many small crimes. George is just one of many predators. But his story has a lot of weight. It shows an uncomfortable truth about how oppression works, not just through violence, but also by corrupting the people who are being oppressed. A system so wrong that it turned victims into killers. How many people like Moses saved money for years only to be let down? How many families like Sarah's were broken up? How many Jasons were turned into snitches and then thrown away? How many Hannahs saw babies ripped from their arms? Exact numbers were lost. Every number stood for a life lost, dreams shattered, and unimaginable pain. Sarah never got over the loss of her daughters. Moses killed himself before he could get justice. Jason went missing in Texas, his soul broken by betrayal and betrayal. After Hannah lost her baby daughter, she was like a shadow. Benjamin died trying to do what Nathan and Morgan did. Some people say that Nathan and Morgan were just as mean as George, and that killing someone for revenge isn't justice. That point of view leaves out important context. They couldn't get to courts, lawyers, or legal systems that protected their rights. The only thing that was certain was that George would keep ruining lives as long as he lived. Nathan's last words echoed in the slave quarters for years. "I will sleep better knowing that others won't have to suffer at Holly Ridge." Words from a man who found peace after his last act of defiance. George could have made better use of his freedom, could have really helped other slaves and been a force for freedom. His intelligence, word skills, and connections could have been used for good. That choice shaped his legacy, not as an improbable success story, but as a cautionary tale about how victims can sustain systems that exploit them when they perceive personal benefit. The money he had saved up disappeared. The forest took back Holly Ridge. The main property was sold, and the memory was gone. But his name lived on in whispered stories and warnings passed down from generation to generation. It was a reminder that predators come in all shapes and sizes, and that oppression doesn't care what color your skin is when there's money to be made. The flames that killed George only lasted a few hours, but they were very strong and fed by years of justified hate. They destroyed hopes and ruined lives. Nathan and Morgan were not perfect heroes. By law and by morality, they were murderers. They made their own justice in a world where official justice didn't work for people like them. The ashes of Holly Ridge stayed visible for years before the forest took over the area. Only people remember the terrible things that people do. Nature doesn't. That's why we tell these stories, not to praise violence or revenge, but to remember what happens when people are treated like things, when greed betrays solidarity, and when systems make it so that the only justice available is that which is won through final sacrifice. Tuscaloosa went on living. The Black Warrior kept flowing. People who stayed behind went on with their lives. For those who knew the story, George remained as a symbol of the worst humans can become when corrupt systems offer opportunity to profit from suffering. Nathan and Morgan were still examples of how much justice costs when official systems don't work. You don't measure legacy by how much money you have or how long you've lived. It is measured by the effect it has on the world. George left behind fear and pain. Nathan and Morgan set an example of resistance, even though it cost them. In that story, two lessons persisted through generations. First, betraying your own people, no matter how profitable, builds only a foundation of ash. George couldn't be protected by any amount of money from the hatred that had built up over hundreds of lives that had been lost. Second, resistance, even at total cost, matters. Nathan and Morgan didn't change the system, didn't free other slaves, didn't live to see better days. But they made sure that at least one predator would stop hunting. The next day, the sun rose over Tuscaloosa, as it always does. For those who stayed, life went on. But something had changed, even if it was small. People didn't fear George Crow's name in the same way. Now everyone knew he wasn't invincible, and that he died as helpless as any slave he had betrayed. That knowledge alone was a kind of freedom, even if it was small and short-lived. What do you think of George Crow's story? Please leave a comment below with your thoughts. If you want more disturbing tales from America's past, subscribe to Legacy of Fear and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode.